Hi, my name's Claire Brayton,
And I'm Hanan Claire.
and we did our project on African colonization.
So this is our thesis statement. Europeans colonized Africa to access its resources for their own economic growth, and the political and economic consequences of this colonization was devastating to all African countries.
So you may or may not understand what this thesis statement means now, but hopefully throughout the presentation you'll find a deeper understanding for what this means and African colonization. So we're going to start with a map, just to kind of give you an idea. So right here, Africa. And another place you're going to hear a lot about in our presentation is Europe. So right here. Yeah, so there's a map and our table of contents. So what we're going to talk about in our presentation. We're going to talk about the scramble for Africa, so what it was, when it happened, and why it happened. Then we're going to talk about colonization of Africa, so what places colonized where, and then we're going to touch on slavery in Africa. So we'll start with the scramble for Africa.
Okay, so what was the scramble for Africa? Well, if you were to look this word up on the internet, you would find a list of different definitions, and the one that best fits our presentation is to struggle or to compete with others for something in an eager or uncontrolled and undignified way. So the scramble for Africa was the invasion, occupation, colonization of African countries by other European countries. So originally Europeans had very little interest in Africa, but in the 1870s the interest for Africa peaked. So the scramble started in the late 19th century and it ended in the 20th century. So just to show the intensity of the scramble, in 1870, only 10% of Africa was under the control of the Europeans, but in 1914, only 44 years later, 90% of Africa was under the control of the Europeans. This also shows why they called it a scramble, because so much happened in such short time.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what caused the sudden scramble, so why were all these European nations quickly coming into Africa? Well, one of the things that led to it was a period of new imperialism, which meant that it was a time when countries were trying to achieve colonial expansion. And a word you're going to hear a lot in our presentation is imperialism, which you learned from the other presentations, but it's when a stronger country seizes a less strong country. Another word you're going to hear is colonization, and that's establishing a colony away from one's origin. And lastly, a colony is a country under control of another country, often far away. So again, something that caused the scramble for Africa was that it was a period of new imperialism. It was also a time of national expansion, so countries wanted a more powerful nation, and they thought they could achieve this by taking up more territory. Military support or strategy was another reason, so by taking up more land, you could prevent the enemy from expanding. Economical advance, so Europeans especially wanted new markets to sell their goods, as well as dominance over raw materials, which Africa had a lot of. And religion. So it was during the time of the slave trade, and people thought that by introducing Christianity to the Africans, it would cultivate them or civilize them and lead to the end of the slave trade.
So how is Africa divided? Well, so the Berlin Conference was held between 1884 and 1885. Its purpose was to prevent serious intensity over the division of Africa. Basically, all the European countries who were interested in having a share of Africa got together to decide what parts they would take over so it wouldn't become a whole mess. And it was hosted by King Leopold II of Belgium.
So after this conference, the African rulers were not invited to attend the Berlin Conference to decide the division of their continent. So how did the Europeans actually manage to conquer Africa is what I'm going to talk about. So first we'll start with what held them back. There was a disease called malaria in Africa, and Europeans were easy targets. But when the Europeans developed a drug to prevent the infection, this no longer held them back. Another thing was transportation. So African rivers were difficult to navigate. However, when the steam-powered riverboat came out, it allowed Europeans more travel around Africa. And in addition, Europeans had much more advanced technology than Africa, such as the Maxim gun, which was the first machine gun, and this is right here. So that helped them conquer Africa.
So where was controlled by who? So this is a map of Africa. It's a color-coded map to show the different parts of Africa, and they were colonized by different European countries, so the color-coded list. So this is a map of Africa after the scramble, so in 1914. At the bottom of the list, it'll say independent African states. So Liberia and Ethiopia are the only two independent states in all of Africa. So just to show the big range of how much of Africa itself owned compared to how much of Africa the Europeans own, we've taken out Ethiopia and Liberia just to show you the scale.
Okay, so the end of the scramble. Since the scramble, since World War II, 50 African countries have become independent. However, the continent will still be forever scarred. So next we're going to talk about colonization of Africa.
So colonization in Egypt. So this is going to show a map of Africa, just to show you where Egypt is if you don't know. It's located in the top right-hand corner. So Muhammad Ali is a ruler. So Muhammad Ali was given control of Egypt in 1805. He was a powerful leader and he did many great things, such as establish schools, grow cash crops such as cotton and cacao, and he also trained his army using the French military. All these activities were very expensive for them, so it caused Africa to become in debt of the Europeans. But the Europeans didn't really pay any attention to Africa at the time, and they only started paying attention when the Suez Canal was built by the French in 1859. So the Suez Canal was a canal that was built to connect the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, shown here on the map. The reason why the Europeans took interest into this idea is because when they were going to Asia to trade goods, instead of going all the way around Africa to get to Asia, they could go from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, which would cut their trip in half. And obviously, Muhammad Ali did not support this idea for that certain reason.
Okay, so another big aspect of colonization in Egypt was the British rule. In 1870, British got some control of Egypt by buying stocks, because like Hanan said, they were in debt of the Europeans. So Egypt became their protectorate, and a protectorate is a state that's under the control and protection of another state. So the British did help out Egypt. They paid loans and they sent in military forces. However, protectorate is a bittersweet word, so although the British helped them out in many ways, they also used Egypt for their own advance as well. And because of this, African nationalists complained about the British ruler.
So French influence in colonization. So between the years of 1830 and 1912, Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco were controlled by France. So Algiers, today known as Algeria. So in 1830, the French king, Charles X, wanted Algeria. So he encouraged a lot of settlement there, and later 1 million Europeans settled there. So the French had taken over Algeria, and the British were moving into Egypt. So the French panicked, and they took over Tunisia, which sent the Italians panicking as well, because then they were worried that they wouldn't get a part of Africa, so they took a piece of North Africa.
So this is a map of where the French had, so right here. So Italian influence in colonization. Italian had protectorates Eritrea and a piece of Somaliland, which are right here. But another thing that they had is in 1912 they colonized Tripoli, and it was kind of like I was talking about earlier about preventing the enemy from expanding. So by them having Tripoli right here in Libya, they could prevent the French from expanding, which was one of their strategies.
So how were the colonies ruled? There were two ways of colonies being ruled. So the first way was by direct rule, so complete control of the government. So the ruling country would appoint their own people as leaders, and they also believed that Africans couldn't be rulers. And so France, Portugal, Germany, and Belgium all used this method. The other way was indirect rule, so the British made the laws, native individuals were rulers, and they were rulers instead of the European officials. The laws were made by the ruling country, and so the British used this method.
So the end of colonization in Africa. What led to the end of colonization in Africa? One of the things that led to the end of colonization in Africa was a rise of nationalism due to an increase in education, and nationalism is a strong patriotic feeling of one's country. Another thing was other success stories. So when Africa heard about other places gaining independence, they thought, why couldn't they? And racial equality. So the Africans began to feel as though the Europeans were treating them as inferior beings, and this was on their own land, so this kind of helped them rise up against colonization. And World War II also contributed in a lot of ways. So some African people provided service in war, and when they were fighting alongside the Europeans, it made them feel as equals and gave them a new perspective on political matters. As well as France and Britain were weakened from the war, and they were large colonial powers, so this made it that much easier for Africa to break free.
So this is a map of Africa. We have a timeline from the 1950s to the 2000s. The purple states are showing which countries are becoming independent, according to the timetable.
Yeah, we can play this at the end.
So the effects of colonization in Africa. So some negatives were that for community, African traditions were lost because they were forced to adapt to European ways. And people were forced to leave their homes in order to find work to pay for taxes and also to earn a living. Another one was religion differences. So Africans were strongly encouraged to become Christian. So this caused conflict in communities. And since the Europeans also controlled the schools, the children had a very biased education. So they were taught that their parents' beliefs were wrong, and they were only taught European history, not their own. So another thing was Europeans were always superior, so Africans always had to adapt to European preferences and changes. So for example, no African clothing at work was permitted just because Europeans didn't like it. So now for the positives. So the economy. So the Europeans used African resources to help Africans. They also created new jobs, and for transportation, they built roads and harbors so it was easier to travel throughout Africa. Education. So they increased literacy and they encouraged children to learn to read and write, and they also built schools. So for medical care, the big thing was they introduced it to Africa. So that was very important because it's a very key part of just life, having medical care.
Okay, so now we're just going to talk a bit about slavery in Africa. So how did the slave trade start? Europeans occupied trading posts along the coast of Africa and throughout the mid-1400s, and eventually these posts were where the slave trade was held.
So the African slave trade. So some most common ways to become a slave were you were a prisoner from war. Some people just sold themselves in desperate times for food and water because it was if you were a slave, at least you had a little bit of nutrition, better than just being on the street and starving. And also slaves were used to increase the population of certain areas.
Okay, another type of slave trade was the transatlantic slave trade, and in many ways this slave trade was a lot more brutal than the African slave trade. So slaves had to travel to America over the Atlantic Ocean, and they had to leave their families and their communities, as well as their labor was their only worth, rather than in the African slave trade, simply their presence for population would be enough. And so this type of slave trade had larger numbers, and out of these large numbers, thousands died because of the long and dangerous journey across the Atlantic Ocean. So why was the slave trade happening? Europeans needed a solution to help their market, and the answer would be slaves because they were inexpensive and abundant.
So how did the slave trade take place? So they made a trade. So if the African rulers were to supply the Europeans with slaves, the Europeans would give them a trade such as guns, ammunition, and manufactured goods. So it was also known as the slave gun cycle. So the slave gun cycle started with the Europeans giving guns to the Africans in exchange for slaves. And then the Africans would then use those guns to gather more slaves. And then they would bring those slaves to the Europeans to various trading posts and to get more guns. So it's just a vicious circle that just goes on and on.
It's the end of the slave trade. In the 1800s, Europeans stopped fueling the slave trade, and anti-slavery treaties were signed by over 50 different African leaders. It was also outlawed in many different European countries at different points in time. However, some European nations illegally continued, and Hanan's going to talk about what Europe did to prevent this illegal continuation of the slave trade.
So the West African Patrol. So it was started by the British, and so it stopped slavery by stopping any ships from coming from West African ports, basically checking any ships that came through to make sure they weren't containing slaves. So when the slaves were rescued, they were taken to Freetown, Sierra Leone. It was also known as the safe haven for slaves. But in 1822, a new safe haven was formed, It was called Liberia, and if you recall earlier, Liberia was one of the states that remained independent during the scramble for Africa. So, in the West African Patrol, for between 1808 to 1860, British West African Squadron seized 1,600 ships and freed 150,000 African slaves. So, the effects on the economy. So, the decline of the Atlantic slave trade in the 1820s caused dramatic economic shifts because most profit came from slaves. So, they had to find a replacement of things to trade. So, basically cash crops, and that included cacao beans and cotton.
So, we're going to end with our thesis statement again. Europeans colonized Africa to access its resources for their own economic growth, and the political and economic consequences of this colonization was devastating to all African countries. Volume's not on. Okay, you guys don't get to hear this. Play it. How do you turn this on? Oh wait, you guys can write down the thesis statement.
You have to probably slide the over or the computer anyways.
So much work for this song, guys.
Graphic arts.
I know, it got stuck in my head and
Never
I went away.
Okay, here we go.
That was so fast. It was stuck in my head.
All of them.
Yeah, finally went away. Where?
Does not stop me.
Weird.
Oh yeah, there we go. Sorry.
Why is it not coming up?
Why is it playing music? It's okay, you guys can hear it from the. Sounds like the beginning, but that's okay. It's okay.
Oh, it's not showing.
Oh, now we go. Here we go. Okay. Okay. Is there any questions or comments? We can play in the background. Yeah. Alvin. Alvin. Yeah.
Can you go back to music again?
Yeah. Oh. Okay. Well, hopefully it still plays.
Yeah.
Oh. Haley.
I really liked it because I just felt like everything was pretty intimate.
Your graphics were really amazing, I have to say. They were really cool and they kept it interesting. Rather than a average
Like the little X through the thing and the off scene, kept for emphasis and stuff like that. That was great.
Shannon.
It was good, the visuals and everything, just the only thing was that maybe, it was hard to, because I feel like I'd look at something and then go to write it down, and then I'd look up and it would change, and I have, half.
Yeah, that's the thing with having an entrance.
Yeah. So were African children taught differently than regular European children at that time?
I think so. Yeah, they were. Because they. Yeah.
So what was the question? What was your question?
So good.
Prior to colonization?
Wait, how were they?
How?
So hard.
Oh, guys.
Well,
So the question is, how were African children traditionally taught in different ways than they were later under colonization, like the European children?
Okay. Well, Europeans they kind of introduced education. So they didn't introduce it, but they increased the schools and they increased the literacy. So they improved the education. But how they were actually taught, they weren't taught their own history, and one of the big things was that they were taught different, for religion, they were taught different religions than their parents. That's why we said conflicting communities, because the children would have a different religious view than their parents, so they would learn that their parents' view of the world was wrong. So that was kind of, I don't know if that answered your question.
Did that ask, or do you mean what were the traditional African
I was
systems?
asking,
How did African peoples traditionally educate their children, before you?
how African children were treated?
At this,
Were they taught as much as the regular European children, or were they taught half as much?
Oh, I don't know exactly how much they were taught, but I'd imagine they'd be taught less because they're inferior. Allison.
I liked your presentation a lot. I kind of wish you went a little more into like what the lives of people were like during it, because there are like a lot of factors which I liked, but there's like a little bit about what it was like for the people of like Africa.
Yeah.
I just have a question. How did the song relate to your project?
There was no relation. It's like the end song of a movie, you know?
Okay.
Just like
Hanan Claire.
these were supposed to like the yeah.
It's enough in graphic arts to topic classes.
Alvin?
I was just wondering, like, how do you make the, like, on the top, how do you make it, like, appear in the middle and then, like, go to the top? It was really cool, like, to know
Do
what
you actually I can tell
Did you do this in Keynote or in PowerPoint?
PowerPoint.
So go ahead.
Oh, okay. Let me find a slide where it does that. Oh, okay, here we go.
We can like choose.
Okay, so like
One, two. How did you do?
you like make it, you give it like a path, right? So you give it a path, so it goes up, and then as it's doing the path, you do change color, so it changes to white, and then as it's doing that, you get the other one disappear, and then this one is just like regular season. Yeah.
That's cool.
Do the Google one.
The goop. Oh, okay.
How do you do the map one where it?
Yeah, that one was
Yeah.
The map one we didn't make. That was like.
Can you put it on after?
we have to do that.
Okay. I'll just-
Whoa.
Oh no. okay.
Oh.
That was
Type that
cool.
back.
What?
It bothers me. How do you do that?
What the heck, Claire? Stop.
It's just path. It's just path and like box.
Oh, it's
That's so
But
good.
how do you path if it's like a Google search?
No,
Because you just get like a picture of the Google search, like
You
a
screenshot it?
Yeah. And then I like, but the PowerPoint doesn't let you type it out anymore. Like the animation entrance isn't type out, so I had to like get it from other. Anyway,
Can you put it back on the map?
which
When
one?
you like colored it. Or like.
Oh yeah. Wait, the purple one? Yeah, the purple one. Right there. She's right. Was it getting them?
Oh yeah.
Just let it sink in.
So just leave it on for a second. And
Yeah.
I want to show them something on the map.
What?
This is the timeline. This is 1960.
Yeah, do you guys see that, the timeline when these things were happening? Did you guys notice this? See, there's a timeline of when the colonies kicked in, going down simultaneously to the reveal of the map.
I feel like that one doesn't.
So, before leaving it,
President voted that one.
okay, so just looking, guys, just to look at this map, I know it was an ambition, guys, of the British. They talked about building a railroad from Cape Town to Cairo. So Cape Town is down here, and Cairo is up here, here. And they wanted to be able to build a railway all the way up, all on their own colonized land. So it just showed how intensely colonized it was, and that was just the British, like, so there was other land. So most of this was like most of West Africa was colonized by the French.
Yeah.
And then like they said, a bit of Italy down here, a bit of Belgium and Germany, particularly in the center. But there was enough British colonies that they could literally build a railway from one tip of Africa to the other and stay on their own territory, which is kind of ironic. This little tiny island that claimed the rest of like a continent, basically. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, I think you guys were both really well spoken, and I like the amount of information that was on each slide. It was spread out very nicely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this one like
So that's a really great graphic too, right? It's very communicative with the flags and
Zach.
It was a good like line of like the power of the presentation.
Good. I think the order you did it in was really effective. And if you did it in a different order, it would have been harder to understand. Yeah, so awesome. I just wanted to say, I thought it was excellent. It was super well organized. So the order of it, the way it was structured and sequenced, and I thought that your use of, here, I'll let you close it and then trash it, right? Put it or eject it properly, safely. So the order. So things to notice. It was really well structured in a way that was very logical and well sequenced. I thought that the amount of text per slide was appropriate. So like it wasn't like the font size was good, and there wasn't too much text on the screen, so that it was like you couldn't read it all. Although the pace perhaps was, I didn't feel that the presentation was paced too quickly overall as a presentation. But if you're trying to get notes, I can see how you would have struggled to get everything down at the pace that you were going. But it didn't have like a, if you were just sitting as just listening, then it was an appropriate pace. So depending on what you're looking at. Also, the vocal, you guys knew your stuff really, really well. So that was evident. You weren't looking at notes, and you clearly kind of understood. You had, the knowledge was internalized, so you knew it well enough that you could just speak kind of off of your own understanding, and your vocal animation was strong, so you seemed to be legitimately engaged with the material, and you spoke with confidence and authority, and so that was really, really well done. I also really liked the way that you used definitions, like that you really defined the vocabulary. I think that's very helpful. And then I like the fact that you did the table of contents. So first we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then you did it, and you came back to it. So it kind of helped, I think, map things out in our brain. Did you guys find that? Was that helpful structurally to have those little signposts? And then repeated things, like you'd say, okay, just to remember, nationalism is this, or so that was really good in terms of helping deepen understanding as well. So I thought that was really strong. So good work. Huge topic. So definitely there was a lot more that could have been said on this topic, but it is massive. So I think what this did was it provided like a really good introduction that was actually quite a comprehensive introduction. Like we understood what colonization was. We understood the key events around the scramble for Africa, the timeline, how it ended, the slave trade. Not enough room in one presentation to get into daily life, but that would be something that would be really interesting. Coming back to Amin's question on education, interestingly, I think that prior to colonization, people in Africa would not have had like necessarily formal schooling in buildings like what we have, right? And it wouldn't have been relevant or necessary, because if you don't have, mostly what children in any culture are educated to do is to function in their culture and their society. So if your culture is based on, depending on where in Africa, the cultures would have been really different. So in North Africa, there would have been a strong Islamic component and Arabic component, and the cultures were more elaborate, right? More similar to Western cultures. Like you saw that with the Ottoman Empire stuff that was presented. And so they had like very sophisticated, very elaborate. They would have had schooling they would have learned literacy and reading and writing, and they would have studied potentially the Quran. They had rich history in the arts and in like a whole like architecture. So schooling might have been more similar. But if you went to more West Africa or Central Africa or Southern Africa, you would have found areas where people were still living a lifestyle that was more of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And so then what do kids need to know? They need to know how to grow food, how to hunt for food, how to track wildlife, how to find water, how to build housing, how to deliver babies, how to use the medicine that they did have available, like natural medicines and whatnot, to heal people. So that would have been how they learned. And most traditional systems of education would have been apprenticeship models. So children would have learned by doing things alongside of their parents. And you just like, if your parent was a midwife, You would learn just at a certain age. You would start going with her when babies were being born, and you'd start by watching. Then you'd start, and then you'd continue. You'd help. You do a task with the parent, and then you would gradually increase your independence until you were doing things on your own. And what's interesting about this is that for all the cultural superiority that Europeans have projected onto the world, we're coming back full circle. And obviously in medieval times, the Europeans used an apprenticeship model for education. And this whole system of education that we have now, where you guys come to one central place and you sit in a little boxy classroom and like listen for many hours a day and you sit static, that actually had a fairly short lifespan. Like it was a system of education that many people say was designed for the colonial era. Because they had people, like what did the British system need? They needed people to go out into the colonies to be able to administer the colonies. They needed people who could work in factories. They needed people who could work in administrative offices. So it changed over time, right? Like as the technology changed, they maybe needed people who could work at Telegram, or like prior to that, they needed people who could write a letter and send it off to the administration. So I would say that critical thinking, creative thinking, that hasn't ever really, those are not traditional mandates of our education system. Obedience, that was pretty big. Knowing your place, knowing how to do the task that was assigned to you, knowing how to do it consistently so that the letter coming in from the office in India and the letter coming in from the office in Africa and like the whole machine would work well because everybody knew their place. And there wasn't a big emphasis on critical thinking because you don't want people to question their place and the authority that is there in a colonial system. So now, in the society and culture that we're inhabiting in the 21st century, critical and creative thinking is really important. That's what we're going to need to drive our economy. So lo and behold, it's becoming more important in our education system, but we're still in a place of transition from an education model that was evolved to fit into a hierarchical, class-based model that had different values and different goals, and that was highly contextualized by the colonial paradigm and the technology of the times, to a system where, you know, creativity and critical thinking and all of those things are more important now. So we tend to think of it as being static, right? Like that this is how education's always been in the West, or this is how it's always been here, or that this system's better than that system. And I think it's important to remember what the system is designed to do and how good is it at doing what it's designed to do. So yeah, a system where you all have to sit down and listen to me, the teacher, for many, many hours, that's really good if your goal is to make people obedient, especially if you're allowed to like smack people on the hands with rulers and things if they're disobedient, right? If you're looking for something different, not such a good system, right? The other thing that we're coming back to full circle is that apprenticeship model. So on our Pro D Day, everyone's saying the best method of education, the best learning tool is apprenticeship. So now, whereas guilds and other systems used to do apprenticeship around, you've got the shoemaker, he's making the shoe, the young apprentice is watching him make the shoe, then he's making it together with him, and gradually he's making his own shoes. It's not quite like that, but you would be watching thinking processes, of critical thinking processes, of creative thinking processes, and gradually increasing independence. So I think that's interesting to see how that model was denigrated by the colonial masters in their colonized subjects. And yet now those same people are coming around going, actually, it's the best way of learning for empowered, independent people who are going to be accomplished in a particular craft or skill. Okay, cool. The other thing that I was thinking about, Algeria. I knew it. I was like, this has to do with the Ottoman Empire and then ISIS and all of these things. But yes, where I was going with that, Algeria is actually relevant to the stuff that we were talking about with Paris as well. Remember I mentioned that to you guys, right? Yeah? No? About ISIS? So, Yeah, so we have some time to talk about stuff. I thought that maybe what we could do is if you guys are still interested because you guys didn't finish that article, would you like to return to some discussion on that and do it like after the presentations for the next little while? One of the things that I have observed, and one of my perspectives on this, is that people talk about Paris and they talk about ISIS in the like ISIS killed all these people in Paris. I see things a little bit differently. I think the people who killed the people in Paris were French and they were Belgian. They weren't Syrian. They weren't from the Middle East. They were born and raised in Europe. And I think, in my opinion, I think that there's two separate issues on the table. One is ISIS and what's happening in the Middle East, which pertains to Syria and pertains to the Middle East. And the other is disenfranchised, disempowered people who are still being subject to racism and poverty and a lack of opportunity in Europe, who are growing up feeling disenfranchised, feeling marginalized, feeling victimized by the cultures in which they're living, and they in turn are potentially grabbing hold of an ideology from somewhere else and then applying that at home. So if Belgium didn't have problems of its own, if France didn't have problems of its own, in terms of this, of the legacy of racism and discrimination and poverty and whatnot, those attacks would not have happened. We didn't have people getting on planes from Syria and going and launching those attacks. So, and there's a good CBC radio documentary where it's just like a 10-minute clip where someone spoke about. I've noticed it's been very absent from the media discourse. But there have been a couple of places where I've seen people actually tackle that head on and speak to that. So I thought that might be worth a viewpoint that might be worth listening to at some point over the next couple of weeks if you're interested. Yeah.
Wasn't it like one of them came with like the Russian refugees?
Most of them were. My understanding was that most of them were born and raised in Paris, and there was one Syrian passport that was found nearby. But my understanding is that they later discovered that that was forged and that it wasn't actually an authentic document at all, and that they were actually all like nationals. And one thing that I've experienced from the time that I've spent in France is that there's a huge amount of the legacy of colonialism because of Algeria and the Algerian wars for independence that lasted through the 60s and the 70s. Like the wars of independence were very protracted. It varied from one country to the next. But some of these countries were literally at war for 20 or 30 years, fighting for independence from their colonial powers. So that devastates a country right there to be engaged in civil war for 20 or 30 years. And the French continued to send French, Caucasian French nationals to Algeria for administrative purposes, for military purposes, and so on and so forth. So there were French people who were originally French who were stationed in Algeria, white Caucasian people who were born and raised in Algeria and identify quite strongly as being Algerian and African, despite the fact that their heritage is very strongly French. Likewise, there were Algerians who moved to France who identify very strongly as being French, but also as being Algerian. But the French people as a whole have not really embraced Algerian migrants. And because of the colonial relationship between those two countries, there was quite a lot of migration from Algeria to France. And because of the protracted civil war, there's a long history of conflict between them. Plus, there's a long history of conflict throughout Europe with Islam and the various Islamic empires that have come through Europe and conquered most of Spain for 700 years, or there's a huge rivalry between those on ideological levels as well and historical levels. So you've got layers of conflict that have spanned centuries, but most recently it's the Algerian thing, and I've just noticed being there that's a very strong and dark undercurrent, and I noticed that being there I've noticed over increments of years that it's gotten progressively worse as there's been more recent migration and as there's been more conflict in the Middle East. That underlying tension that was there previously has just gotten stronger and worse. And the French are the French state is really great in so many ways. Like, they offer great health care, they offer great benefits, like they've got this great sort of socialist democracy. But a lot of times people of Algerian descent have not been included in that as well as they should have been. And certainly in Belgium, that's the case from what I'm hearing.
Well, it's not too related, but have you been to Algeria?
I haven't, no. I was born and raised in South Africa until I was 7. So I know South Africa. I've been to Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana. Yeah, mostly Southern African places. And yeah, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa. Those 3 places. So West Africa is not somewhere I've been at all. Anybody here been? Africa's an interesting place too because, yeah, it's interesting. Allison, you had your hand up a while ago. Do you remember what you were going to say? You. Sorry, I said Allie, but I meant Allison. Nope. Kind of started a while ago when I was talking about ISIS.
Oh yeah, you said 2 reviews or something.
I still haven't been sent the password. I still haven't been sent the code. I did send Mr. Eagleson an email asking if he could obtain it, and he said he'd have to write back to the people. Anyways, I haven't got it yet. Sorry. Hey, but you know what I could maybe show you is the little 5-minute documentary that went with the Atlantic article that wasn't working on that antiquated computer. Let me see if I can get that working.
Yeah, Colin and Rowan.
They're not going till next day.
Oh, they're not. Never.
They were going to start, yeah, I had them scheduled, just like, remember I said I had you scheduled on, like, whatever the class before, I had you scheduled on the 11th and the 15th, because I thought you might, like, I didn't know if we were getting through. Last year, the presentations were much longer, and so I wasn't sure when I did the schedule how long you guys would take. They've been very efficient and effective, I would say. So they haven't been really long, but I haven't felt like that they're not going into great enough depth. Like, so I haven't felt the lack of content, but they're definitely not taking as long time-wise. Yes. Okay.
I told you. No, my skin is super dry. It looks like. What? That was funny. I'm like wait, what song? Every day.
Wait. Sean's not here. Sorry, what's it like that? I feel like Claire, I feel like you were talking like 75%. But I can't present next day. Yeah, Hanan, right? Yeah. Claire was talking like 70%. But not like that's bad. That's like you're ready. I grabbed your attention. No. Why? Claire. Claire, you know? Hey, I'm sorry. I was like pushing you when you were trying to speak. Yeah. You were like, Claire was showing in the video. That was about it. So then I kind of tried to stand there so you wouldn't like, because then you were like speaking, but like audio. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. No, it's faster. That's here and there. What? Do I have like? No. You don't have like no, you don't have to read this. Okay, I think. This is more like having school. No,
Sebastian Fox and
You guys make a video? Yo, I feel like we talk way too fast. I don't know if it's Claire. I don't know if it's talking like, oh my god,
were we supposed to read Act 2? Because I think I read Act 3. Yeah, I never actually read it. Which was
I don't know. I'm trying to go through it again. Alright, so I've been touching it like a week. Do you have line paper?
what? No, I don't have line paper. Sorry, I got this at home.
Alright, so here's an interview with the guy who wrote the article that you guys started reading last time. So let's start by looking at that and go from there.
Should I take notes? I'm just really feeling like taking notes.
How did you go about it? How did you get started on those things? Well, the first thing I thought when you sent me was, am I going to have to go to Syria and Iraq to do this? And I was surprised to find as I looked around that not only if I went there would I probably not come back with a story or with my life, I would come back with a better story if I didn't go there. So the tactic that I took was to find out who were the people who have a voice, maybe not quite authoritative, but one to which other people were looking when they were trying to find out what the Islamic State stood for. And that took me to London and to Australia. How did you find those guys in the first place? There is this large community of ISIS supporters online, sometimes called the fanboys. And they have a kind of network that you can map out, see who follows whom, who repeats messages for whom. And there are a few of them who are particularly important as disseminators of ISIS ideology. And the guy in Australia was considered one of those. His name is Musa Cherantonio. And did you find him at all resistant to sitting down and talking to you about ISIS? He was definitely reluctant to talk because the Australian press viewed him as a kind of grotesque menace. And when I approached him, that wasn't what I wanted to hear him say. I didn't want him to support beheadings necessarily. I just wanted to find out exactly what he thought in great detail. So the things that he wanted to tell the world were the things that I wanted to listen to. This is a guy whose great passion in life is reading about history, about trying to figure out what the prophetic literature says, what's going to happen according to the prophecies that he thinks are true. Did you find yourself wanting to argue with him? The arguments that I would be tempted to have with him were arguments I knew I would lose. I'm not a scholar of Islamic law, right? And some would say he's not either, but he definitely thinks about these things constantly, and he thinks about the obvious objections, including the objections that other Muslims offer to him. So it would have been silly for me to suggest that I could convince him that some other version of Islam is the one that he should follow, or that Islam is wrong, but I could certainly sit there and ask him, what exactly do you think, and why do you have these opinions that so many other people, so many other Muslims don't share? And where does their confidence come from? It comes from prophecy. In the case of this particular bit of correspondence, the guy more or less just said, what we're doing is preordained in texts that were written down 1,400 years ago. You will not be able to stop these things from happening. What's your explanation for what pulls people into this group? And when we're seeing them successfully recruit consistently worldwide, pulling in kids from
Scandinavia, from the American West? What is it that they go? Why would they run to ISIS instead of running in the other direction?
One of the common types of sale that I have seen is a description of the kind of daily life of what it might be like to be in Birmingham or East London, and saying, do you want that? Do you want to go to your fish and chip shop and watch a football game? And is that the most you're ever going to see out of life? Or do you want this incredibly meaning-rich environment where you're in an apocalyptic battle? This is something that contrasts so starkly with the kind of quotidian struggle of working class life, perhaps in London, that I'm not surprised that it's appealing to people.
And so, what was the response, if any, from members of ISIS to the piece?
So it was tweeted out. I've seen it tweeted out before, and there are quibbles with details, but I think in general, they saw the portrayal of ISIS in the Atlantic as one that they could recognize. They saw it as something that legitimately attempted to portray them in terms that they could see and say, yeah, that's more or less us.
I'm actually, I'm curious how you, having published the piece and followed up now a couple times on the website, do you feel done with this subject and you never want to think about it again? Or do you feel like it's something you're going to return to journalistically?
I think I'll keep looking at this subject for quite a while. It begins, this group, as an intensely ideological movement. And ideological movements, they tend to kind of routinize and give up elements and compromise. This group seems particularly resistant to compromise. And so as they're challenged and as they find ways in which it might be helpful for them to give up what they currently say are non-negotiable aspects of their platform, it'll be fascinating to see what compromise looks like with them, or if they stick to their guns to the very end and have a spectacular demise.
With new app lights, you can control your Christmas lights with your smartphone.
Great. What an awesome contrast, huh? Okay. All right. Can I get Lucas to please turn on the lights for me? So can I just get you guys to tell me, what did you think of that little film clip? Any responses, any thoughts, any questions? No? Did it seem exactly like other things that you've heard about it so far?
I think the journalist looks at ISIS in a different way. He's like, I thought I would have to go there and then write about it. He's like, I realized if I came here, I could get like a better article out of it.
Right, which was fascinating. The idea that a lot of what is happening with ISIS and their recruitment and all of that stuff is happening globally and is happening online in virtual communities. So if you can tap into that, yeah.
I think the author had a lot of courage and bravery in the sense that he was kind of freely talking about this, and he seemed not opinionated, but he seemed to have a set plan, and he wants to continue talking about this.
Right. And what did he say was the response from the people whom he interviewed to the way that he represented them? Was it positive or was it negative? Were they angry about what he wrote or were they supportive?
It wasn't really negative, but exactly.
I think what he said was that they felt that they had been accurately represented by his article. So, or that many of them felt like he didn't change my words, he didn't totally misrepresent me or whatever. Like this is, he said what I said in the interview and he's accurately represented that. So I think one of the places that people get into trouble as journalists about speaking out about things is if they say things that are derogatory in a really clear way, or they're doing things that people believe are misrepresenting them or their faith or their beliefs, So, you know, we have authors like Salman Rushdie, who's been apparently, do you know Salman Rushdie? Yeah? Last time? Okay. Yeah.
Read this guy's article.
We read the article. So the article that you guys read last time was written by this guy who was just interviewed, but apparently you also talked about Salman Rushdie, who's had like
the basement.
death threats since he wrote what he
like
remember?
sunshine in the thing.
So Salman Rushdie was accused of being derogatory to Islam and to Muhammad and so on and so forth. And so I think that there are times when you speak out and you're negative that people fear for their lives. I don't get the impression that this guy is feeling fearful, because I think that the people that he interviewed are feeling like, you know, he just reported on what we said. I think that the people that he's reporting on in his article come across as really delusional people, but clearly they don't see themselves that way. So if they're saying, I believe in this, and I'm sitting here from my perspective going, oh my God, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard, that's not how they're seeing it, because they believe in it. So I don't think that they're feeling angry with him for saying this is what these people believe. The filter is coming from me, the reader, who's projecting that that's like the craziest thing I've ever heard. So for me, when I read this article and when I saw the interview with him, I was strangely reassured, because I had previously, like right before looking at this, I had watched a PBS documentary on Frontline about ISIS, and I was really scared by that. I was like, wow, like these people are really crazy and really dangerous, because they were talking about how they'd conquered so much territory in the Middle East, and I had this sense that these guys they definitely are brutal. I mean, there's footage of them just mowing people down with guns, and like the carnage is crazy. And if I was living in the Middle East, if I was living in those countries, I would for sure be terrified of these people, like, because I think that they are just absolutely ruthless and violent, and I mean, I think it's out of control. But living here, I felt like these people, their beliefs it's not going to spill over. I think when people in Paris got really scared about, oh my God, all this violence is spilling over into Paris, I don't really think that that's what's happening. I think that ISIS seems to be really fundamentally concerned about gaining territory, establishing a caliphate, and bringing the prophecy of the apocalypse into being. Did you guys get that far in the article? Okay, so basically, a number of people who are at the heart of this ISIS movement, and it seems complicated to me, but what I mean from it is that the ideological core of this belief system seems to be people who are going back to the scriptures that were written by Muhammad in the 7th century, and all of the monotheistic faiths seem to have this apocalyptic vision, right, about the end of the end of days, like when God's judgment is comes to earth, and there's the second coming of the Messiah, and it will be the day of judgment, and all souls will be judged either to eternal damnation or they will go to heaven and be rewarded. Do you guys know something about those kinds of prophecies? Okay, so there's prophetic literature in all of the monotheistic religions. So these people believe that if they can set up a caliphate, which is like a Muslim